Greetings, Eric's UK here with another vid. Today I thought I would talk about Star Trek as a role-playing game. There have been at least 4, possibly 5 Star Trek role-playing games that I'm aware of. The first, and what I consider oddly the best, is the version done by FASA during the 1980s. This was, well, the version I've got is a box set that came with 3 books. You had a player's book, which was like the character creation, you had a games master's, and then you had a kind of really odd second book for the games master that had like random tables today to generate planets and alien races or life forms and things. The reason this particular one is my favourite is it has one of the most, I think, interesting character creation systems that I've seen. So it was, the default game was obviously original series, and so it had human, Vulcan, Tellarite, Andorian, a couple of the ones from the animated series, the Cation, which are the cat people, and Edo, who are like these weird 3-legged reptile people, and these were playable races. And you had a series of stats, I think it was about 6 stats, and it was 2d10 plus the modifier for that particular race's stats, and you basically did them in order, because some stats might have a plus 40, some might have a plus 10, so on and so on. It had a skill system in a way, not exactly the same, but in a way like how Chaosium does theirs, with this huge set of column of skills essentially. And some of these had a base set that was based off of your like dexterity or something like that, things like dodge. But the character generation system, which is where I really fell in love with this, is quite clever. So to start with, you have a selection of life skills, and you get so many points to spend on life skills. And I think this was like a default plus something to do with your intelligence equivalent stat, if I remember correctly. Bear in mind, I haven't looked at this in years, and it's packed away somewhere in one of these boxes. And you were given this box, and these were sort of like life skills. These were the things that you picked up as a child and into your teenage years, and you got to basically pick so many of these and put points into them on a 1-for-1 basis. And skills were like 100 percentile system. You then got another box, which was your like young adult type things as you've learned as you're getting older, your high school equivalent. You then got another box, which was your Starfleet Academy, the basic skills that they would teach, and you would get this at this sort of level, and then you'd spend points on the rest. And this is one of the things, I know a lot of people grumble about character generation systems that are random because they don't get what they want. I actually prefer the more organic way like this. You can still go for what you want. You can still try and be the security chief, or you can go for a captain or a science officer, whatever. But the system kind of generates you a more, as I said, organic. Not everyone's going to be the same. People are going to pick things up differently, this sort of thing. And the way it used to work was you had a chart, and you would do so many tours of duty. You would always have a flat number, but then depending on where you were going would determine how many more you would have to do. So if you were going to play the captain of the ship, you might have your base number, plus you might have to do another 4. If you wanted to be the first officer or a section head, like, you know, chief medical officer, chief engineer, you might have to do another 3. If you were just going to be a general crew member, you might have to do another 2, you know. It was all based on where you're going to go. So obviously the captain's going to have the more experience, but there's only going to be one of you, and they might not always be going on an away mission. In fact, the game, as I recall, even sort of suggested not having a captain as a player character, but have the department heads be the player characters. And your tour of duty was a random role. So you might end up doing something like serving on a Constellation class ship like the Enterprise. You might be doing a science station, researching a new planet or anomaly. You could be assigned to the Merchant Marines, or the convoy escort, or whatever. There's about 8 different things, and whatever you were basically assigned to would generate you a series of skills again. And you could, after each term, you'd roll again to see where you were being assigned until you completed your set number of assignments and you were ready to go. I really like this sort of character generation system. Dark Conspiracy is another game that uses something quite similar, and I'll get to that when I come to that particular video. The other nice thing that this had was how the initiative system sort of worked. It took us a little while to get our heads around it. But essentially, down the side of your character sheet, you had a column that was set off into 10 sections, 10 down to 0. Well, it would be 11 sections, sorry. 10 down to 0. And based on your sort of like agility type stats, would basically say where you started, your current maximum. And every combat you would start at that. And the GM would count down from like 10, 9, 8 until you got to the people who were on that level, and they would say what they were doing. So firing a phaser might cost you 2 actions, which means you'd go from 8 to 6. Or running across a section of corridor might only cost you 1. So after everybody had acted, you went down to the next one. If you were on that point, you could act again. If you weren't, you had to wait until it got down to it. So you had to kind of decide. There was a whole chart to say what certain actions cost in action points, and you had to decide how you were going to spend your points essentially. And then at the end of the combat round, it would go back to the top again. It would reset. Now, this was a really good game. If you are a Trekkie, you will like the FASA system. Obviously, I am a Trekkie of the classic and next gen era stuff, next gen era specifically. And there were a shed load of scenarios that were released for it, and I mean a lot. There were a few duff ones, as there always is, but there were a lot of really good ones. But the game had some issues. One, this is a science fiction game that doesn't come with any Starship combat rules. I think there was something, but it was so basic it didn't even take up like a page. It was, it was really sort of like a waste of space. It was missing that, which was very odd because basically to have the combat system, the ship combat system, you had to go out and buy a whole new game. They released, I call it a board game. It was called the Starship Tactical Combat Simulator, and it was a set of hex maps that you put together, and you had tokens for different ships, and you had tokens for planets. And I give it credit to this. This is kind of very clever, if awkward and convoluted way of doing things. But you had each of the different classes of ship that it gave you. And bear in mind that back then, other than things like the Enterprise and the Reliant and the Excelsior, there wasn't much else. So they made up dozens and dozens of ship classes for Federation, Klingon and Romulan. And these are really good. They put a lot of thought and backstory into this, which obviously went out the window the moment Next Generation came out. And each character, each station head, would be given a console, basically. And each ship had a certain amount of power that had to be allocated to shields, weapons, shield facings, because ships had 6 shield facings. And as you took damage, your shield strength would drop. If the engines were damaged, you would lose some of the power you could allocate. And there was no way of ever having everything at 100%. And it was really clever, and it worked really well as a separate game, but it's really made ship combat in the role-playing game really, really awkward. We kind of blagged it a lot of the time, to be fair, but we had good fun with it. As I say, they released a number of scenarios, some really good ones. They released ship recognition manuals, which was extra ships basically for Federation, Klingon, Romulan. They did source books for the Klingon Empire, the Romulan Star Empire, which also allowed you to play as those races, so you could be, for the time, the bad guys. They did a book on the Federation and the planets and its history, all of which again went out the window as soon as Next Generation came out. And ultimately they lost the license for 2 reasons, as I understand it. One was that they made the game very militaristic. They made the Federation very kind of less peaceful, and there was a lot of wars in the background that they made. A lot of scenarios featured a lot of ship-to-ship combat. But also they released, and I think from what I read, when they did the Next Generation Year 1 source book, Paramount weren't happy with it. And plus, this was a time when they were really bigging up the new show, as it was, and coming up with a set canon. And it didn't fit with what FASA had done. And ultimately, they lost the license. Which was a shame, but you can kind of see why. The next one I'm aware of, technically, I'm going to say it doesn't really fall as a Star Trek role-playing game, but there was one released in the early 90s, as I recall, where you played Starfleet security officers. So it was a little bit more James Bondy rather than Star Trek, and I don't think it lasted very long. I vaguely recall seeing one copy of it in a game store once, and that was it. The next version that I'm aware came out was by Last Unicorn Games, LUG, who did a very awkward and convoluted system. They did a Next Generation rulebook, they did an original series rulebook, a Deep Space Nine rulebook. Basically, rather than make it one compatible system, they made, depending on what sort of Star Trek game you wanted to do, they made the rulebooks different. They were all compatible ultimately. You could take, if you really wanted to, play something like a Delton, which would appear in the original series rulebook, and play it in Next Gen or DS9. But they made each one a separate, like, £30-35 rulebook, which was bloody expensive. They released a series of scenarios and some books for that, which were quite good. They did one on time travel. They did, I think they released a couple of scenarios, or scenario books. I think there was one where you got like 3 or 4 scenarios in it. But their system, I barely remember it, and I remember at the time it went over my head. It's very, very awkward. I'm trying to think right now how that system went on character creation, and it's not coming back to me quite so easily. We played it, I think, 2 or 3 times. We tried to run some mini campaigns with it to try and get our heads around it, and it just didn't really work. Ultimately, I ended up giving those games to my mum, who was a big Trekkie, and after she passed away, I ended up selling them off. At the end of the OOs, I think it was, or partway through the OOs, Decipher, who had done the Star Trek collectible card game at one point, got the rights, and they released a Star Trek role-playing game. And we did try that one. And that was really awkward. That had a really... If you have a character creation system, you normally start at the beginning and you run through it in order how they create a character. The Decipher game didn't do that. It started off with that, but then you'd have to jump maybe 2 chapters to find the races, or even a separate book at one point. You'd then come back to somewhere between those 2 points to get the ship positions, the class, career, whatever you want to call it, and the skills. And then you'd have to jump after, and trying to create a character for that system was time consuming, and just the ship, they did a book for ship combat, ship combat for starships, which were, by this time you had a lot of canonical ships in the Star Trek universe from DS9 and the films and so on. But it was another one where the ship combat system didn't work. And the reason ship combat systems, I find, in sci-fi games don't work is they don't, how can I put this simply, they don't operate from a 3-dimensional playing area. One of the arguments that comes up with the TV shows is that despite the size of the universe and where planets are and how the alignment or orientation of a star system might be, starships always meet on a level playing field facing one another. No one ever comes in like that and they're upside down. And basically the combat system essentially always assumes that you're on the same level. You could fly over something, but you could never do anything awkward. And I find this, Star Wars does this in its various incarnations as well. I think the original D6 version by West End Games of the Star Wars game sort of got round this. But generally, in a 3D environment, in a void, I've yet to really see a role-playing game that could handle Starship or even Starfighter combat systems, and this was just as bad. We tested out some ship-to-ship combat just as a trial, just to try it out, and it was an absolute nightmare. It didn't really work. I think we tried one campaign with that. I bought all the books second hand because I wasn't going to pay out for a whole new game again, and we played maybe once or twice and I got rid of them. I sold them on to a second hand gaming company. Outside of that original FASA game, I've never been impressed by a Star Trek game. I've tried to use GURPS to do it, and again the game system doesn't quite do what I want it to do. It's a shame because as a big Trekkie, I kind of want to be able to play a Star Trek RPG or run one. If the game, if that sort of what's the word? Not genre. If the Star Trek licensing type thing for a role-playing game has any real problems, one is that the majority of the time it should be a proper role-playing game. I mean, look how many episodes of Star Trek in general. There's no ship combat. There's no combat. It's diplomacy and haggling and murder mystery or something like that. And Star Trek fails to do that in a role-playing game, because I find that generally if you don't have some sort of action-orientated element, whether that's a combat or a ship combat or something like that, players tend to get bored. I think a lot of players are far too used to the D&D style, hack and slash, we'll say, for lack of a better term, style of gaming, that trying to just role play is not beyond them, but just it's awkward. They get bored, let's just put it that way. The other problem is, as I just mentioned, murder mysteries. There is a really good episode of DS9 where, I'm going to spoil it now, but it has been over 20 years, okay guys, so don't have a go at me. There is one episode where people on the station are assassinated, and it's all because the assassin has a rifle which teleports the round it's firing. So they can be on the other side of the station, but they know where they are, so they fire the rifle, the bullet comes, appears and goes and kills them wherever they are. And it's a really good episode for a murder mystery. The problem is, in Star Trek, every time I've ever tried to do this in a Star Trek game, somebody flips the tricorder out and goes, I scan for DNA. I scan, you know. And generally, there's only so many times you can turn around and say you don't find anything or nothing before players start calling shenanigans, and you can't do it. Murder mysteries or mysteries of something like that will, in Star Trek, require information that can't be readily obtained for some reason. The moment you can go, well, this is where the Idonian ambassador's daughter was kidnapped, we'll scan it and, oh look, there's Idonian DNA, and oh, what's this? Ferengi DNA. It's a Ferengi. And suddenly, you know, it might sound like, well, fine, you've now just made it so that they can investigate the Ferengi on the station or on the ship or on the, you know. But it's hard to explain. It spoils mystery scenarios when you have the magic bullet that can do that. And Star Trek was no different. Yeah. So I really enjoyed it. But you have to have the right players who aren't going to take the piss with it or what have you, and going to enjoy a roleplay element for a full, you know. You've also got the problem, I had this with my guys, who gets to be the captain? I have had players absolutely lose it because somebody wanted to be the captain and then somebody else wanted to be the captain. And it's just like, oh. You know, or I've had it, I mean, we had a laugh with the FASA game, you know, in our teens, we weren't overly serious with our gaming, but I remember my friend Big Dave with his security chief, again, ship combat or didn't like somebody, and he would suddenly turn around and go, what's that, captain? They're sitting by the open fire. Yeah, and it's, you know. But no, I like Star Trek as a role-playing game if it can be done right and with the right players. That's your problem. Have you guys had any experience with any of these game systems? And what were your thoughts on them? Did you play it as a Trekkie or not as a Trekkie? Because I think that can probably colour the perceptions of the game. And if you have played a Star Trek RPG and you have the same thoughts that I do, how would you fix it to make games better? I look forward to your comments down below. And lastly, would you guys mind hitting the like button if you like the content? Subscribe because it helps me with the channel. And I will grab my Romulan ale. Cheers, everybody. Take care, guys, and good gaming.